Good evening and welcome to the second week of our study, God of Restoration, Poetry and Prophecy in Isaiah 40 through 55. So today we're going to cover the last part and the majority of Isaiah 40 for lesson 2, The Great God Reigns. And let's first review, let's go back to our first lesson and look what we did in lesson 1 over this initial poem, verses 1 through 11 of Isaiah 40. So you may remember that there are 3 sections or books of Isaiah. So we could say first Isaiah, second Isaiah, third Isaiah. So someone tell me if you remember what those are. What's first Isaiah about, or who is it to, or who is it from?
It's from God to Israel, like the people of Israel, rejoice because you're now in good favor. Make the way straight. Here I come.
Okay, so great. That is the opening of the second section of Isaiah, which is telling us, Isaiah 40, to tell us, yes, I am coming to you. So that addresses a later time than first Isaiah.
First Isaiah is when they're actually going into captivity. That's
Right.
what it. So they've lost favor with God. They've been exiled.
Yes, so the exile in between, exactly. So in first Isaiah, what we have is God's word to the guy, Isaiah ben Amos, or Isaiah son of Amos, who is the initial original prophet Isaiah. And this would have been around 740 to 700 BC. And he's in the southern kingdom of Judah, while the northern kingdom is being conquered and taken away to exile by Assyria. So the southern kingdom of Judah is being told, like, look at what is happening. And God says, I will save you if you will change your ways. And God is particularly concerned about their justice and protection of their vulnerable populations. But we know from the rest of the narrative also idol worship. So we have this situation where God is coming to Isaiah, and then Isaiah is going to the people and saying, change your ways so that the same thing doesn't happen to you. Now, what we know from going back to the narrative that's in like Second Kings and all the way through, is that they don't, in fact, change their ways, do they? So the southern kingdom of Judah is eventually overtaken by Babylon and carried away into exile as well. And that story, like the full unfolding of it, we have some overlapping chapters between Isaiah, it's like 36 to 39, and the middle of Second Kings. But if we read the Second Kings, we see the full story of them going away into exile. And then when we get to chapter 40, what we have is kind of a break in context. So, what happens is 150 years have gone by from Isaiah's original situation where he's saying, don't let this happen to you, to when it has already happened. They've been in exile. So 150 years later, they've been in exile about 40 years, or maybe just shy of 40 years. So that now this period in exile is coming to a close. And the premise of Isaiah, second Isaiah, Isaiah 40 through 55, is God is proclaiming their sentence has been served, their time in exile is over, and God is coming to save them. Now, it is a little bit confusing because we're still talking to the southern kingdom, the Judahites, but they've always been part of Israel, and just like as Israel is the name for the people of God, they're addressed as Israel, all the way through Second Isaiah. So you'll see it say, "Oh Israel, oh Jacob." This is the Israel and Jacob of the Southern Kingdom. Yeah. Questions on First and Second Isaiah, or comments? Anything? So there's a third Isaiah that is later still, and it addresses the exiles after they're already back in Jerusalem. So another break in the period that's being addressed. Okay, so someone on Tuesday asked, well, tell us exactly who is writing second Isaiah since it's 150 years later. Is it, or since it concerns the period 150 years later, is it the guy Isaiah? And the answer to that is, of course, we don't know, and scholars differ. I tend to think that it is another guy, that it is one of Isaiah's disciples. And we have in First Isaiah sort of stories of Isaiah commissioning his disciples to keep and protect his teachings and his prophecies. And we have periods where Isaiah is speaking in first person, and other little passages where Isaiah is talked about in third person. So we believe that the disciples of Isaiah have set his work together into a whole book later. And I tend to think that it is a later disciple of Isaiah in the school of Isaiah. So we might call him the poet, or we might just call him Isaiah still, who is writing in second Isaiah. The tone changes. It's very lyrical. It's very poetic. We'll point out some poetic elements in today's passage. But it speaks on Isaiah's themes. It's like it takes Isaiah's themes and applies them to a new context. Now, could it all be the same guy Isaiah? It sure could. That is a possibility. Questions, thoughts on that? This can be a little bit of a controversy, a point of controversy, if someone thinks like, well, if you say it's not all written by Isaiah, then you're saying it's not all inspired, that somebody messed with it. And I don't think that follows, right? I think that the setting together of this material is part of the process of inspiration, and that's how we get our inspired and authoritative scripture. So still the glory to God all the way through. Okay. Well, that was our first lesson, and we did kind of the mini poem, and we talked about how it's sort of structured, those 11 verses in a little pattern, A, B, C, B, A, so that we have like a little self-contained unit, and then we'll do the rest of the chapter today. In that first, we saw God proclaiming the idea of the being called to speak as a theme. We saw good news as a theme. And we saw God's might and love, and that God is coming, God's self. That's the nature of their rescue, is God coming to them. So someone read for us Isaiah 40:12 through 17. We're going to take this in 3 sections.
I'll read.
Thank you.
Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, and marked off the heavens with a span, and closed the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighted the mountains in the scales, and the hills in a balance? Who has measured the Spirit of the Lord, or what man shows him his counsel? Whom did he consult, and who made him understand? Who taught him the path of justice, and taught him knowledge, and showed him the way of understanding? Behold, the nations are like a drop from the bucket, and are all accounted as the dust on the scales. Behold, he takes up the coastlands like fine dust. Lebanon would not suffice for fuel, nor are its beasts enough for a burnt offering. All the nations are as nothing before him. They are accounted by him as less than nothing and emptiness.
Okay, thank you. I like your translation of verse 15, because in mine it's a little bit obscure. So when we get to verse 15, we'll talk about what that little bit about Lebanon means. And I thought yours made it much more clear than mine does. But let's start at verse 12. Okay. What visual image? There's a series of questions. We can assume these are rhetorical questions, right? Both the author is assuming the audience knows the answer. But what kind of visual image are they setting up?
A mighty, mighty being.
Yeah, mighty, mighty, and doing what?
Measuring, counting, knowing.
Yeah. Okay, so he measures the calculates the dust of the earth by the measure, weighs the mountains in the balance. What's happening? What's this a scene of?
It's creation.
Right, this is creation. The creator, it's like the creator has just like is pouring out the building materials and putting them on the scale and using them for his creation, right? And the author assumes that the reader knows that this is the Lord, this is Yahweh, right? And we get in verse 13, who has directed the spirit of the Lord. You'll see that's in all capitals. That's because that is the proper name, Yahweh. If we were to translate it directly, we would have something like Yahweh, um, but we use that Lord traditionally. So they're specifically referring to the God of Israel, right? And that is will be a contrast. They're not referring to the gods of the nations, but rather the gods of Israel. This is the God that can just measure out the dust of the earth and make something out of it, right? And what's 13 and 14? What are they getting at? No, more rhetorical questions.
It sounds like he's asking, or it sounds like they're referring to Jesus here.
Oh, how so? Interesting. Tell me more.
Well, I mean, just from a standpoint of, who is he consorting with in doing these things? Like
Okay.
in the creation, story, Jesus is there and everything is made through him, and it kind of reads that
Yeah.
way.
Yeah. Made through him as the word of the Lord, is how uh, John 1 describes it. Great point. And we have this, the counselor is sort of a traditional title. I, so I think, and that we talked about this last week. These verses mean more than one thing very often, right? There is these underlying meanings that point forward to Jesus. But I think on the surface meaning, what we have here is the idea, did God need a collaborator? Did God need a consultant? And what is the implied answer to did God need someone to teach him knowledge?
Mhm.
No, right. So that the idea is like no one told the Spirit of the Lord how to create. And I think what may be going on here is that Babylonian creation stories describe creation as the result of these beings having battling and tearing apart one another, and it was a violent and multi god process. And so this describes something totally different, right? And that you get a real sense of that in the Genesis creation story, especially Genesis 1, how serene it is, how in control it is. It's not a chaotic battle process that needs someone to teach someone else, but instead, God has the sovereignty to just measure out the dust of the earth and make something out of it. So why address creation? Why is that the subject that the author, the poet is taking on to start with? Why creation?
Does it not kind of go back to the beginning? Like it sets up his sovereignty, how much greater he is than any of us. But it points back to the beginning and his original design intent.
Yeah, okay. Great. And there's a couple of points in there. Number one, it sets up power and sovereignty of God, doesn't it? I mean, and I think we feel the same about creation because you think about like a statement of faith. At our church, we have a Sunday morning statement of faith that goes along with the Apostles' Creed. And the line about God is, I believe in God the Father, maker of heaven and earth. And so maker is the main, it's one of the main characteristics of God that we focus on to say this is what we believe about who God is. God is the maker of heaven and earth. So it's a work of ultimate power and imagination and love, I think, to create us and then be the power that continues to sustain us, maybe is implied as well. And sort of within what you said is this idea that this is God's first act of working within human history. And so if God is willing to work in human history as the creator, then it it sets us up to understand that God is willing to continue to work in human history as a savior, as a rescuer, right?
Also
So,
sets up a difference from pagan gods where, there's this whole belief that, oh, they don't, some of them are believing that, they're just out there and they're not paying attention to us, this, that, and the other. And it's a stark contrast again between other gods and the God of Israel.
yes, yes, exactly. So I think that is sort of the implied question behind this whole passage, right? So in the ancient world, and especially in the peoples around, in the nations, the peoples around Israel, the understanding is that if a God is powerful enough and if a God wants to, then that God will protect its people. And a battle between nations is understood as like a battle between their gods. So if a nation has been conquered, then their God either wasn't powerful enough or didn't care enough to protect them. So behind this text is the implied question: is Yahweh powerful enough? And does Yahweh still want us? Because if God chose to abandon us, maybe, is that, that's the question. Will God ever choose us again? Do we have any reason to put hope in God? Is God powerful enough? And does God love us? Do we have reason to hope in God? And so that is, the backstory of this whole passage, isn't it? And we can relate to that, can't we? Isn't, in some ways, when we ask questions of faith in modern life, that's the question that's at the heart of everything. If there's a God, then what happened? If there's a God, then why is the world in such a mess? Why are people suffering? Why are all of these things going wrong? Can we believe in a God who lets this world happen? Can we believe in a good God when we're surrounded by trouble and evil? And so we can relate to this question for the Israelites when they are in the suffering of their oppression and exile. So let's see what the poet says. He begins with the creator. God is the creator who weighs the raw materials to build the world without consultation and all on his own understanding. And so it's time to make some comparisons. Who can we even compare God to? And how do those comparisons bear out, in God's favor or in the other's favor? So the way that the rest of this text is organized is on a series of 4 comparisons. Compare God to each thing in turn. And I was sort of delighted to discover this because when, I was just reading it and it seems like it just kind of meanders all over the place. And so I don't know if y'all found that to be like, okay, we're talking about this thing, we're talking about that thing, but it is organized. I just couldn't see it until after I was like taking like verse by verse notes. So let's look at the first comparison. Look at verse 15 and 16. What are we comparing God to in 15 and 16?
Perhaps nations.
Yeah, I think the nations, right? This is the word for the peoples, the non Jews, all the other national people groups of the nations surrounding Israel. And all these groups will have their own gods, right? So comparing to the nations, sort of has that implied understanding of their gods as well. But is God impressed with the power of the nations? Right?
Drop in the
Is
bucket.
this where the
Has
expression drop in the
nothing.
bucket comes from? What were you saying, Bethany?
Oh, I said they're just a drop. They're a drop in the bucket. That's it.
Yeah, a speck of dust.
Not even a drop.
Yeah, and so it's this idea that no, there, if God has weighed out the dust of the entire earth, each little nation is just a speck of that, right? And we have this idea that even my verse 16, it says, even Lebanon is not enough to burn. It's like, what? Why Lebanon is not enough to burn? Um, Lebanon is famous for their forests of cedar. There's stories in the Old Testament where they send away to Lebanon for fine cedar to build the temple of the Lord, to build the palaces. So even Lebanon's forests is what's implied, combined with the beasts of a whole country, would not be enough for a proper burnt offering to show God's superiority compared to these nations. And I feel like the poetry of this left quite a bit for us to try to parse out to understand what that was saying. But even Lebanon is not enough for fuel, and burnt and beast not enough for that. That makes it a little clearer in your translation, Bethany, because all the nations are as nothing before him. Now, does this mean that God does not care about the people of those nations? No, we could try to make a case from that, but that's not the context here. And in later chapters, we'll see God's provisions for those people. So this is not saying the people don't matter, but that if we're going to compare God in power to these nations, the nations can't compete at all. Okay, so that brings comments, questions? Okay, so that brings us to our next comparison. Would someone read verses 18 through 26?
Okay.
Thank you.
To whom then will I liken God? Or what likeness will you compare him with him? As for the idol, a craftsman casts it, a goldsmith plates it with gold, and a silverman fashions chains of silver. Who is too expensive, impressive for bearing such an offering? Select a tree that does not. He seeks out for himself a skillful craftsman to prepare an idol that will not totter. Do you know? I have not heard. Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been declared to you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he who sits above the vault of the earth and who inhabits all like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in. It is not reduced rulers to nothing, who makes the judges of the earth meaningless. Scarcely have they been planted, scarcely have they been sown, scarcely has their stock taken root in the earth, but he merely blows on them and they wither, and the storm carries them away like a stubble. To whom then will you liken me, that I should be his equal, says the Holy One? Lift up your eyes on high and see who has created these stars, the one who leads forth their hosts it by number. He calls them out by name because of his greatness of his might and the strength of his power. No one of them is missing.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so in verse 18, we'll go back to the beginning of that long passage. Is we get this is explicit, right? To whom will we compare God? The Israelite God is saying, who can we, or the prophet is saying about God, who would we compare God to? Okay, so what's the next comparison? Starting in verse 19.
Idol made by people that doesn't move.
Right, idol. Okay, made by people, right? God is the maker, but the idol is a made thing, made by a made thing, right? A person is a creation, and then the creation makes a creation. So it's such a contrast with the maker, right? And what else? There's several ways that the author makes idols look ridiculous. What things are in there?
The silversmith with the fashion chains of silver.
Yeah, it has to be decorated. Let's pretty it up. Let's make our idol look prettier. Yeah. What else?
Well, it's something that doesn't move, doesn't do anything.
It doesn't, except that you have to prepare an idol, verse 20, that will not what?
Rot or decay.
Right. Okay. So if you have enough money, you'll cast it out of metal and coat it in gold and decorate it with chains. But if you don't have money, you have to pick a tree that won't rot, right? And these idols and the ridiculousness of idols is an element that is going to come up multiple times in Second Isaiah. And there's another passage where you take a nice bit of log and put half of it on the fire and cook your dinner and make an idol out of the other half, right? So it's a point of absurdity, right? That this is something that you worship, that you have to find something that won't rot and won't, what else?
Fall over.
All over, right? You got to work hard and make it stable, or else it might just fall over. And how embarrassing when your God falls over. Were you going to say something, April?
Sorry, I'm just laughing at the commentary. No, I was just gonna say maybe it needs to not have any leaks. Even a small leak would be serious trouble in a flood like that. That I was just laughing because of you made a joke anyway.
Okay. Well, I thought I saw your mute go away, so that's great. So it's a made thing. It's decorated. You have to make sure it doesn't rot or fall over. And this is all compared with the power, the sovereignty of the Creator God, right? So in this comparison, the author has worked really hard to make sure that God, it's only a few words, and yet the idol looks totally ridiculous. Now, it's interesting because, no one who worships like a God who has a statue, right, actually believes that the statue itself is entirely the God, right? It's a representative of the heavenly being of the God, right? The power behind it. And yet Yahweh, the God of Israel, has always prohibited images as not a way that humans should relate to God. So even though the statue itself is not exactly the God, the religion of statues is shown to be impotent. It doesn't have power behind it. It's useless. To worship a man-made symbol shows that you have a man-made religion, and those religions can't compare to God. And so it's a little deeper than just making fun of somebody's statue. statues, right? But it's just this idea that that the creator God is so far beyond anything that you're trying to manufacture in your statue or your religion of statues, right? What's verse 21 about? We've got some more questions.
Mhm.
It's asking, don't you remember? This is something you've been taught from the beginning of time.
Yes, yeah, that is so. These questions, do you not know? Have you not heard? These will show up again at the end of today's passage, in a passage that's tends to be pretty familiar to us as like a favorite verse of a lot of people. But those little repeated "do you not know, do you not hear" actually show up several times in Second Isaiah. It's a repeated element, and I think you're exactly right about what we're doing with that. It's you should know, you have been told. Look back to the beginning of what you were taught about your God and who your God is. And so, if you have been teaching your children as you're supposed to, if you know your Israelite heritage, if you have passed down the law and the keeping of the law, then, and in fact, Isaiah 150 years ago was doing that very thing and has entrusted his disciples to continue his work and continue those teachings. And so he's saying, you should know this. You should remember. He's calling them to remember who God is. And this is a major theme of Isaiah. Remember the character and nature of God. So, verse 22, we're about to hear what it is that they should know, what they should remember about God. What is 22 about?
Talking about God in heaven watching us like little tiny ants or grasshoppers.
Yeah, it's interesting. It says it sits above the vault of the earth. Now, yours may say circle of the earth. It literally is vault. Usually, very often, the Old Testament will talk about the vault of heaven, but this is sort of putting the speaker in heaven looking down on the earth. And so that idea of like a separated space, one from the other. So we're kind of back to the subject of creation, aren't we? And celebrating God as the creator, as kind of the heavenly king, right? It's like a king on a throne with the heavens like a curtain, who spreads them out like a tent to dwell in. Okay, and then 23, we get the next comparison. Who are we comparing to?
Rulers and judges.
Yeah, the rulers of the earth, the judges of the earth. You notice this is a classic. We see this multiple times, but I'll just point it out here. It's all over these passages. This classic Hebrew poetry structure where you have a verse that is a couplet, two parallel lines that say a similar thing, or one may deepen the other. Sometimes you get like a little flip the script in the second one and say the opposite by meaning, this thing and it's not that thing. But this one is just the basic version. He reduces rulers to nothing, makes the judges of the earth meaningless. So rulers of the earth, judges of the earth. Some translations will say princes. So it's the people who seem to be in power, especially in the nations. What are they compared to God? In verse 24, you plant them, they get planted, sown, they begin to develop a root, and then what?
He breathes a sigh, they're gone.
It blows it away, right? This is very much like verse 7 that we did last week, where the grass just it withers in the breath of the Lord. And I think the emphasis is on how temporary they are, right? They are the rulers of the earth. They look like they have so much power over you. And you living your life, maybe they do have so much power over you. And yet, in the time and the power of God, they just wither away as soon as God breathes on them. And so the message for the people is, if you've been wondering whether God is powerful enough or attentive enough to actually bring the promised comfort, the promised restoration, then think about how the earthly powers can just be blown away like withered grass or chaff from a wheat. And verse 25 repeats that idea of comparison, doesn't it? So, fourth comparison in 26. This one's a little more obscure. What is 26 talking about?
Lift up your eyes on high and see who created these. He who brings out their hosts by number, calling them all by name.
What does yours say, Bethany? And see who created what?
Hold on, let me back up. See who created these. He who brings out their hosts by number, calling them all by name. By
It
great-
doesn't say. These what? It doesn't say what?
Yeah, it doesn't. Who created these?
Oh, I gotta check it. I gotta check this. Ah, yes. The word stars is in my translation. I now see that is supplied by the translators.
Mm.
So, yeah,
Obscure, but
yeah, who has created?
I mean, you were just talking about the heavens above, right? So maybe that it's that reference, the stars, the heavens. It's referencing back to the verses before where it's talking about God in the heavens looking down.
Yes,
Well,
yes, definitely. And the word host, the use of the word host tells us something here.
Mhm.
Because when God is shown in heaven, he's always surrounded by the host of heaven, right? Heaven is not empty, it's surrounded by the host of heaven. And so they were often thought to be represented, the host of heaven, by the stars. And in like a Babylonian understanding and some of the others, the stars were counted as heavenly beings, and that you could study the stars, and by the movement of the stars and the planets, you could see the actions and movements of gods. Right? Remember how the Magi are recognizing what's happening in the world of the gods versus the world of the earth by studying and following the stars? And what's so wonderful about that story is that God provided them a message in the stars where they happen to be looking. That's where they look for messages, and God gave them a message there to lead them to Jesus. But we get, we get the astrology idea. This comes up in our culture too, like that maybe the stars under which you were born can tell you something about your personality. Maybe the alignment of the planets right now can tell you something about your destiny today, about what will happen to you today. And so this idea of looking to the stars and counting them as somehow heavenly beings that are going to tell us something of power, it has not really gone away. And that was the Babylonian understanding. And so they would be looking to the stars as the beings of power. But this comparison is, can you compare God to those heavenly beings? God, he lines them all up. He calls out attendance. They wouldn't dare be missing because they're under the power of Yahweh, under the power of the one true God, these heavenly beings as they understood them. God is the creator and controller of the stars. Thoughts on that? Questions? Comments? So we have 4 comparisons between Yahweh God and the nations, their idols, their rulers, and their heavenly powers. And all 4, the the poet continues to show God as superior, as sovereign, as the king, as the creator, as the controller. And creation idea comes up over and over. That's kind of the foundation for God's power, which he shows opposed to all of these. Okay, so let's someone read verses 28 through 31, please.
You say 28?
Yes.
Okay.
No, 27. You're right.
Okay,
Thank you. We
27.
would have skipped 20. I didn't mean to skip that. Yeah.
Why do you complain, Jacob? Why do you say, Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, my cause is disregarded by my God? Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint.
Thank you. Okay. So, verse 27, we finally get to the poet's understanding of Israel's complaint, right? This is really the question that has been behind the whole chapter, but he's finally articulated it. And what is the complaint? What does Jacob or Israel say? Same person, say two different names. What are they saying according to the poet?
You're saying God doesn't love them, he's left them, he doesn't care.
Doesn't care. Yeah. Isn't noticing them at all. They might as well just be hidden from God, because God doesn't notice or provide the justice due me, right? And why would they say that?
Because they've been slaves and they've been mistreated for, what is it, 150 years, 250 years?
They probably like 40 years in exile, but there was a long period
Okay.
leading up to it that things were not pretty too. Yeah. So they've been suffering in exile, and this is the challenge that the poet assumes that Israel is giving. Why didn't God take care of me? And we see the poet doesn't actually say what, doesn't address the why here. Now, later, this does come up, right? And previously, the why was, developed substantially, like you're not obeying God. And we read some of that in chapter 1 last week about the things that they were doing that were not obeying God. But instead, the poet says, do you not know? Have you not heard? Which means remember the truth about God, right? This is the final passage here. This is one of my memory verses as a child, maybe a verse that you've had read, out as a verse of encouragement. And I think it's a deep verse of encouragement. It's also a verse of challenge, isn't it? Because you've got to remember the truth about God. The everlasting God, Yahweh, is the creator. We're back to that foundation of creation, the creator of the ends of the earth. God does not become tired or weary. God's understanding is beyond yours. And yet, what does God do for them? Give strength to the weary. God, this is being said to the weary and suffering. And so God gives strength to you. To the weak, God gives power. They were weak. God gives them power. It says even the strong, even youth, so many times I look at the strength of my kids. I'm like, youth. It's not just youth. It's also they're just stronger than me, but it's there, right? And yet even these young people who can run their incredibly fast races, they get tired, they fall, they stumble badly, my translation says. But those who wait on the Lord or hope in the Lord, those are synonymous in this context for people who are suffering. The thing to do is to put your trust in God, because you can trust God. Yes, you are suffering now, and yes, God did let it happen. But the time has come for comfort and for restoration, and you can trust God to do that. God will give strength to the weary and power for the weak, so that you soar on wings like eagles, not growing weary, not becoming faint. So a beautiful conclusion of the poet is, I've told you how kingly, how majestic, how powerful God is. And now I'm telling you, you can trust God for your own personal strength, for your own personal restoration and refreshment. And that will come from God, because God loves you and has not, in fact, abandoned you. This is good news for those who are trapped in difficulty and suffering, right? And it's true that there's suffering everywhere. And the truth is that if God is the power, then God has allowed that to happen. And so we have to come to the willingness to put our trust in God, in the good news that God is still willing to rescue us and comfort us, and that the rescue is coming. Thoughts on this passage? We've covered kind of the whole thing. This is the longer opening. We did the short opening last week, but the whole thing is really the opening to the section. Well, we reflect, and when we reflect on our world today, we can relate, we can understand, is God powerful enough to save? When we suffer, these are our questions. Is God in control? And if so, why is this happening? And the passage, what this has to say is, doesn't give the answer why. There may be an answer, there may not, and yet God is in control, and even after suffering, we can trust God to strengthen us, to rescue us, and to be with us. We've seen several elements that are going to be important in Isaiah. Creation has come up over and over. We've hit it several times. The word creator or creation is in there, and then there's those elements of stretching out the heavens like a curtain. The silliness of idols, the ridiculousness of idols, that will come up repeatedly, and especially this idea of remembering what you should know about God, remembering the truth about God, remembering the character about God, bringing that back to the center is part of what will be happening as we go through the longer 15 chapters. All right. Well, thank you for being here today. It was nice that we didn't have to change anything. Remote is. We did remote yesterday, and that was great. But this is easy, same as usual. So thank you for your participation. Next week, if anyone is interested in the Tuesday class will be back in person next week. But next week, all of us will do lesson 3, the servant of the Lord. And serve the servant, God's servant, is an important sort of deeper concept that runs through these chapters. And we're sort of going to meet that concept next week. And we'll do all of Isaiah 41, and then we'll go to 42:13. So the first bit of 42 as well. All right. Thanks, everybody.